Well, joining me now to take a look at how the result here in the UK will affect Europe and indeed the rest of the world is the geopolitical analyst and director of the Global Strategy Group, Marco Vicenzino. Marco, Europe has been one of the big issues of this campaign. Immigration, all the issues surrounding that, and a question about Britain's role within the European Union and whether or not it's going to stay. With what looks like a Conservative victory and a Conservative-led coalition, are we going to see that referendum on EU membership?
Well, throughout recent years, Prime Minister Cameron has been somewhat ambiguous on the issue of the referendum. But as we approach the actual vote, his rhetoric became clearer and clearer of pointing towards the likelihood of a referendum. So once again, it's who will be his coalition partner that will play a role. But much of it will be determined by conditions and circumstances at any given time. So I would think he has, and plus he'll be held accountable by certain voters. And the reason he took that position, a much clearer position, was to prevent the loss of votes to UKIP. And this is something that also concerns many other countries in Europe, is that whole issue of populist parties and the rise of anti-immigration parties across Europe.
And that seems to be a common theme across Europe, sort of mature democracies. But the enthusiasm for the European Union and the single market is great and significant amongst the elites, amongst the people in charge, and among the population in times of austerity. Support for those institutions has been declining.
Post-2008, particularly after the crisis hit, and particularly in the European countries, the countries of the Eurozone, you've seen a drop and the rise of the populist parties. Many of the elite in Europe, even the governments in Brussels, have been looking closely at this election, at the previous Greek election in January, and upcoming elections this year, particularly the Spanish election towards the end of 2015. Once again, it's the mainstream parties are very, very concerned with the rise of these and these French, call them French parties, anti-immigration, populist parties, both right and left. In France, you have the far right with the National Front under Marine Le Pen. In Spain, you have the rise of the far left, Podemos. In Italy, it's a populist party which attracts both people from right and left, the Five-Star Movement. And it's a concept that's even in the smaller European countries, it's something on the rise. So once again, it's the UK election and other upcoming elections will be a test for Europe presently and for the long term.
Well, in that case, then, if it's a trend that we're seeing across the continent, how much attention do you think European leaders have been paying to the campaign in Britain? And I'm talking here about some of the rather strong anti-European rhetoric. Are they just looking the other way because all politics is local, or do they see now a serious threat to Britain's role within the European Union?
There's an element of the local to try to play, even the mainstream parties have to play a bit of the populist rhetoric in order, once again, to prevent that loss of votes to the more fringe parties. But I think European leaders are very, very concerned. I mean, just look at France, for example. There's a chance that in the first round of the presidential election, the 2017 presidential vote in France, the socialists won't even make it. It'll be the center-right UMP against the far-right National Front. These are realities that are occurring across the continent itself. In the Spanish elections, there's other parties, third parties, that are challenging the two mainstream parties. So this is, once again, it's just you look at it from a broader perspective. Obviously, here in the UK, it has its own political nuances that are different from the rest of Europe. But in terms of a trend of the rise of these parties, and if there is a Conservative victory, it'll give a sigh of relief to many of the centrist parties. But they cannot get too comfortable.
Well, let's turn away from Europe finally then, Marco, and look at another issue that's reared its head throughout the campaign: spending, how much money, what little money there is, and specifically defence spending. There's been a lot of back and forth between the parties on this, a lot of talk also about the continuation of Britain's independent nuclear weapons system. Where does this apparent Conservative victory leave those questions?
I think in terms of the nuclear issue, I think it'll continue because, once again, the Conservative Party looks at the UK. There's been a reduction in defence spending, but it can't cut too much. It'll question its role within NATO and around the world. Remember, Britain has a seat at the Security Council. It's a nuclear power. Although it's reduced in many ways due to economic difficulties, it still has leverage worldwide. And if there's a cut down more in defense spending, it'll bring it into question not only within NATO but within the United States. The United States, obviously, that special relationship has evolved. The U.S. is looking very much at Europe in terms of the two main problems in Europe is the Eurozone crisis, Greece, and Ukraine. Britain doesn't have much of a part. It's not a member of the Eurozone, and also Germany is playing the central role with Ukraine. So in this sense, I mean, they're saying that Britain has a reduced role. It's not what it was before, but for the United States, particularly on the counterintelligence front, the UK remains a key ally, and it wants it to remain a key ally, not only just in European affairs, but on a global basis.
Well, Marco Vicenzino, for that global perspective on what this election means. Marco from the Global Strategy Group, thank you very much for joining us here on World Briefing.